Because in Jesus' day, in the day when Peter and the other fellows were making their living at fishing, professional fishermen went out at night. They didn't go out in the daytime, they went out at night. And I suppose there were at least several good reasons for that. Number one, the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Tiberias as it's called in the gospel lesson today, is considerably below sea level. Not as far down as the Dead Sea, but it's below sea level. And it's in a semi-tropical climate, not a lot different from Florida, really. And therefore, in the daytime around the Sea of Galilee, it's hot all the time, year-round. It's always hot. And I presume that likewise, because of that fact, not only would it be uncomfortable for anyone to go out fishing in the daytime, but also, the fish, I would think, probably don't come as close to the surface. And so, particularly if you're doing net fishing, they would be hard to catch. And so professional fishermen went out in the dark, in the middle of the night. And they went out naked. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that was, but I suppose that fishing, even if you're not processing the fish, is kind of dirty work. And they, I guess, didn't want to get their clothes dirty. So they went out fishing naked, and Peter, the folks at that time in history didn't particularly enjoy swimming. And so he probably hated the thought of getting wet. So he said, well, let me put my clothes on first before I get in the water. In any case, very accurate details. And it's this kind of accurate detail in these gospel stories which helps to verify their authenticity. The fact that somebody would put in that little petty detail about Peter being naked and having to put his clothes on to jump into the water, that's the kind of detail you only put in if you're telling a story you're familiar with and can testify to its reality. And not only that, but in writing his gospel, John made a little tiny mistake. You say, how can John have made a mistake? Because the Bible is the inspired word of God. Well, that's true, but of course John was human. And John was a man of his time and place and culture. And he told us that when Jesus appeared to the disciples on the beach by the Sea of Galilee, that this was now the third time that he had appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. Well, that wasn't quite right. Peter didn't make a mistake, but he didn't really express it properly. This was not the third time. This was not the third appearance. This was appearance number 4. And John himself tells us about appearance number 1, but he doesn't count it as one of the 3. In fact, it's 4. The first appearance, which is recorded by John, is not one of the previous 3. The first one, you remember that he's counting. The first one he counts is Easter Sunday night, when Jesus appeared to the disciples in the upper room. But Thomas wasn't there. Then the second appearance was 1 week later, the Sunday night after the resurrection, when the disciples were again gathered in the upper room, and this time Thomas was there. And because you remember, the first time Thomas showed up late and didn't believe them. So the second time Jesus appears in the room and Thomas is there and has a really sudden conversion experience, to say the least. And then number 3, and of course that was the one we read about last Sunday, remember? And then number 3, this appearance on the beach at the Sea of Galilee. So you say, but how about number 1 that John can count somehow or other? Well, number 1 was Easter Sunday morning, not evening, morning, to Mary Magdalene. Remember Mary Magdalene? Really, how could you forget her? So that was number one, the appearance to Mary Magdalene at the tomb on Easter Sunday morning. But apparently to John, that didn't count. Because, you know why? Mary Magdalene was a woman. So it didn't count. Because in that period of history, and John, like any believer, John was a man or a woman, as the case may be, but in his case a man. John was a man of his own time and place and culture. And in that time and place and culture, and by the way, Greek and Roman culture was even worse. Even worse. But at that time and culture and place, women really didn't count. Women were not allowed to testify in courts of law. Because you couldn't depend on a woman to get anything right. That's how they really felt and believed. So women could not testify in a court of law. And so, therefore, Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene on Easter Sunday morning, first thing right out of the tomb, well, that didn't count. Because Mary was a woman. And what even more verifies the reality and accuracy of the gospel accounts is that all four gospels witness to the fact that the very first resurrection appearances were to women. In John's gospel, Mary Magdalene. In the other three gospels, various other women who were followers of Jesus. They were always the first ones. And the fact that the gospel writers faithfully recorded that fact indicates the reliability of those gospel accounts. Because after all, if people of your day and age feel that women don't really count, and you can't depend on a woman's testimony, if that wasn't an accurate recollection of what really happened, why in the world would they have included it? If it didn't happen, you wouldn't say it. Because it undercut what you were trying to prove. So if it weren't the case, you would never say it. But they said it. So these were true, accurate recollections of what actually happened. That Jesus rose from the dead, and first of all, appeared to his female disciples. Now, why Jesus appeared to the women first is something we can speculate about. But I think I have a pretty good idea. I think that Jesus knew perfectly well who his most faithful followers would be for all the centuries to come. And I learned this early on in my ministry. I went visiting a particular home, and the man of the house greeted me at the door, and I said, "Well, it's really good to see you here, Pastor. My wife takes care of religion for our family, so I'll take you out back to see her." And he did that, and she was out the backyard, involved in a card party with a bunch of other women. And so I went out and visited with these ladies trying to have a card party, and tried to not be too intrusive or too much in the way. So I learned earlier on what the real deal is. In our house, my wife takes care of religion. So you go visit her and I'll go do something important. So, a good early lesson for me. Anyway, Jesus goes on to have a little separate get-together with Peter. And asked Peter 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" And every time Peter answers, "Yes, you know that I do." And each time Jesus says to him, "Well then, feed my lambs," in the first answer, and then the next 2 times, "Feed my sheep." And I guess the distinction is that, a lamb is a young sheep, and a sheep is a grown-up sheep. So, take care of my sheep of all ages. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. And we're told that at the third ask of that question, Peter, do you love me? That Peter's feelings were hurt. Which is not surprising, but, you know, we kind of have an image in our minds of the early disciples, the men and the women alike, as really pretty colorful figures in stained glass windows who stay right there in nice pious poses and are kind of, you know, set apart from the rest of the human race. But they weren't. They were men and women just like you and me. They could have their feelings hurt, as Peter had his feelings hurt. They had to put their sandals on 1 foot at a time, just like we do. And so they were real people. And they were real people with real recollections. That's why they told the truth about the first appearances being to women, which undercut their whole thing that they were trying to prove. But they were honest enough to report it anyway. So 3 years go by. And 3 years later, Saul of Tarsus, who had come to be known as Paul the Apostle, was a bitter, violent opponent of the early disciples. He felt that the early Jesus movement, the early followers of Jesus, men and women alike, were ruining the legacy of Israel. They were undermining Judaism and all it stood for. And Paul was a really good Jew, a real believer. And so he didn't like these people. And he had gotten, I guess we would call it a court order from the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem to go on up to Damascus, which is only 40 miles from Jerusalem, and to put the collar on any Christians he could catch and bring them back to Jerusalem to stand trial for their heresy. And so Saul's on his way to Damascus and gets knocked right off his horse and has just as fast conversion experience as doubting Thomas. In fact, he's struck blind. And so his companions have to, we are told, take him by the hand and bring him up to Damascus to find shelter and a place to stay. Now, while the newly converted Saul was finding shelter in a hole on a street called Straight, a man by the name of Ananias, who apparently was a leader in the early Jesus movement up in Damascus, had a vision of Jesus in a dream. And Jesus, in this dream, said to Ananias, I want you to go on over to Straight Street, to the house of Judas there, and you're going to find a man named Saul, who you need to help get straightened out. Of course, Ananias didn't want to go because he knew exactly who Saul was and was scared to death of him. But he went anyway because the Lord told him to. And as you know the story, he baptized Saul and prayed for him, and Saul's vision was restored. Now the point is, for this to happen, Saul and Ananias both had to turn around and do something different, and actually dare to deal with someone whom they had previously hated and been afraid of. Because Saul was just as afraid of Ananias as Ananias of Saul. You know, a person who gets into persecution and violence against anybody because they don't like that person's whatever is also afraid. They're afraid of that person, what that person represents. So they were afraid of each other, in fact. But what they had to do now was turn around and deal with each other. And they did, in obedience to God, in obedience to Christ. Now, those of you who were here last Sunday will remember that a big part of Roy's sermon had to do with turning around. Because he answered the question, what next? And that's why I'm calling today's message, What Next, Part 2. The answer to what next was turning around. And there was on the screens a visual of what it means to turn around. With Christ in the center, remember, and then all of us gathered around Christ. It almost looked like a representation of the solar system, with the sun in the middle and the planets revolving around the sun. Only in this case, it is Christ in the middle, and we are the planets revolving around Christ. But as Roy pointed out, to do that, we have to turn around. And now, I realize I'm preaching the same sermon a second time. But see, that sermon was so on target and so good, it needs repeating. It needs to be driven home. It needs to be said, pay attention. Pay attention to what he said, because it was so important. So you've got to turn around. Now, picture in your mind being gathered around a campfire, which is something you've probably all done at some point in your life. So picture yourself gathered around a campfire, and you're looking in at the fire, of course, but also, because you're looking at the fire, you're also looking at everybody else in the circle. You're seeing everybody in the circle. And so, we are turning around and facing Christ. And guess what? Because we've all turned around to face Christ, we're also looking at each other. And hopefully, seeing each other the way that Christ sees us. Not in old ways that we might have seen each other before, if we saw each other at all. One of the great things about being able to stand up here and preach every once in a while, or sing in the choir, or whatever it might be, or even serve in communion, really, is that I see everybody. Now, on a normal Sunday, I sit right over there. Every Sunday, right there, that's my place. My ticket stub says so. But when I'm over there, all I see is the people around me. I hardly see anybody over in this end of the church. I mean, I kind of know you're all here. But I don't see you. I never see you. Unless I happen to run into you walking out. But usually my first stop is the men's room, so I might even miss you then. But right now, I see you all. It's really great. Even right around there. I see you all. And that is, I think, essentially what the message that Roy was giving us last Sunday was. Let's turn around and see each other. And even see each other the way that Christ sees us. Even if we haven't always agreed. Even if we've been at odds. Even if we haven't even necessarily liked each other. Although as far as I know, we all like each other here. As far as I know anyway. But I don't know everything. But in any case, this past week, I was reading a passage, actually I was reading the whole chapter. I was reading chapter 15 of 2 Kings. Now I know in the Old Testament there are two books of Kings, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And what those two books are is essentially a history of the royalty of ancient Israel, both in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, why there were two kingdoms is a long story, so I'm not going to get to that, but there were two Jewish kingdoms, southern kingdom of Judah, northern kingdom of Israel. And they didn't always get along either. But in 2 Kings chapter 15, that one whole chapter retells a very, very turbulent time in the history of the northern kingdom. It was such a turbulent time that on a very regular basis there were royal assassinations. There were some kings in that period who reigned for only 6 months before getting assassinated. I mean, they were just, these royalty in that northern kingdom were just knocking each other off left and right. At the same time, they were off and on attacking the southern kingdom of Judah and having some troubles with other people as well. And you know what happened eventually to that northern kingdom? It fell. It fell to the Assyrian Empire. And the people of the northern kingdom were carted off into exile in Assyria. They were taken right out of their land. And as I read that 2 Kings chapter 15, I said, well, no wonder. No country fighting against itself that way is going to stand for long. And they didn't. They fell because they just kept fighting against each other and even assassinating one another. And I said, well, you know, that might be something good for us to think about. And I'm not going to get into politics because you all know what's going on in this political season. So I don't really have to tell you. So you know that, and you know, unfortunately, there's also such a thing as church politics. And I'm not talking about our particular local church, because as far as I know, there's nothing really bad going on. But at the international level, the United Methodist Church, which as you know is an international church, used to be an American church, but by about the year 2020, the projection is that there will actually be more United Methodists in Africa than there are in the United States, which means our missionaries have done a great job. And we will be in about 5 or 6 years, basically an African church with an American minority. But there's a lot of stress in the structure, so to speak. We have a general conference coming up next month in May. And there are some issues at the national or international level in our church that are so hot and people are fighting for so passionately that it threatens to actually tear the denomination apart. Which, of course, if that happens, Satan wins. But that's another story. Because today, we're talking about turning around. And I hope we'll turn around from that in our church and in our nation. I really hope we'll turn around from that and stop seeing each other as enemies to be defeated. And in the church especially, because what else do we have any influence over? But in the church, it's time to turn around and look at Christ alone and at each other as Christ sees us, not the way we necessarily have seen each other. Turn around, face Christ, face each other, and let the healing begin.